Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and on today's episode, we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be analyzing and looking at a poem, specifically The Eve of St. Agnes by John Keats, a poem from 1819. So, in addition to novels on this podcast, I'm hoping to analyze poetry as well as eventually plays. We're going to start with some Shakespeare plays in a few weeks. But as far as poetry goes, I'm interested in analyzing not necessarily the shorter, more famous poems that we often see, although I might consider looking at a few of those. Instead, I'm interested in analyzing longer poetry, poems that people are maybe less likely to read without the impetus of something like a podcast like this. The Eve of St. Agnes for a poem is on the longer side. It's 42 stanzas of 9 lines each. So it's not as if you can't read the poem in one sitting, but you have to decide to do it. And I do think as a fiction writer, reading and analyzing poetry is really important. For a variety of reasons, obviously for the rhythm and the language. That's one of the biggest things we can get from reading old poetry, or any kind of poetry, really. But secondly, a lot of these older poems, especially the one we're going to talk about today, they are narratives as well. They do have characters and themes and plots, and so we can analyze them in similar ways, the same ways that we analyze novels. From my own experience, it was only recently that I really decided to reread and study some of the older poems that I remember reading from high school and college, such as this one, such as The Eve of St. Agnes. As a fiction writer, unfortunately today, sometimes there's a distinction that gets made between fiction writing and poetry that I think is not really that relevant or important. The truth is, a lot of prose stylists, a lot of fiction writers, they try and write with a very poetic, rhythmical, beautiful, lyrical style. And reading and analyzing poetry can help us hone our rhythm, develop our ear, think about the musicality of language. Many of the passages, right, that we've read from great novels have a similar lyricism to poems, like the one we're going to read and analyze today. So I think reading and analyzing poetry as fiction writers is an essential skill, a really important skill to have. And hopefully on this podcast, periodically we're going to break up the pattern of novels and look at a poem or two every few weeks. Reading, at this point we've done about a handful of novels, 5 or 6 novels, and that's a pretty breakneck speed, right? To read 5-6 novels in 5 to 6 weeks. I do believe in the importance of patience and slowness when it comes to experiencing literature. And so I think these poetry episodes will hopefully be a nice break in between the longer novels that we do. So let's get into The Eve of St. Agnes by John Keats. Now, John Keats is a romantic poet from England. He's one of a group of poets who we refer to together as romantic poets. John Keats, Percy Shelley, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Lord Byron. And then sometimes William Blake is added onto that list, though, as we'll talk about maybe in future episodes, Blake is a little different in terms of his style, just a little bit. Keats, though, Keats is my favorite poet. Keats writes with a level of sensory detail that I find truly astounding and beautiful, and that I find really inspiring as a fiction writer. As we're going to see with this poem in particular, The Eve of St. Agnes, I believe this poem is Keats's celebration of, almost argument in favor of, sensory detail and sensory experience. This poem, to give you some context, right? This poem is it's a classic love story, kind of a Romeo and Juliet style love story between Porphyro and Madeline, 2 lovers from different families. It's set in a kind of medieval castle, right? Very dramatic, very romantic medieval setting. But at its core, this poem has a tension between the spiritual and the sensual that is really interesting, especially in light of the religious themes and the religious significance of the title and of the context of the poem. And I believe that Keats is making an argument in this poem in favor of the sensual and in opposition to the spiritual. I see this poem as part of several other Keats poems that kind of glorify the beauty of sensory experience. You see this in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn, both of which we're going to look at in future episodes. If you remember the last two lines of Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Very famous romantic declaration of principles, essentially. And I think that idea that beauty and truth are synonymous comes through in this poem, especially because, as we're going to see, Keats really relishes the beautiful sensory details as he describes this process of Porphyro essentially seducing Madeline and getting her to run away with him. So the other context I think that's important to know for this poem is the myth of the Eve of St. Agnes. Keats describes the significance, the religious significance of this night in the poem itself. But for context, essentially the idea was that girls who wanted to see their future husbands would perform a series of rites on the eve of St. Agnes, the patron saint of virgins, and they would be given a glimpse, a revelation in their dreams of their husbands, of their future husbands. And Keats basically plays with the kind of sexual undertones of this story in order to tell his romantic tale here. And again, it's part of the very interesting opposition between religion and sensory experience, that dichotomy that Keats creates in this poem, and that basically is the underlying tension of the poem. So let's take a look at the opening stanzas, which I think really set up thematic tension between spirituality and sensuality. One thing that I want to say before we dive in my creative writing classes, I often talk about theme in the context of conflict. In other words, when you're trying to decide, well, what is your story about? What is your novel about? What is your poem, in this case, about? It's helpful to think of theme as a conflict, as a set of opposing value systems that are in conflict with one another. And then you can sort of bring out those opposing value systems often in the very beginning of your narrative. A lot of authors do this in the very first paragraph or the very first, in this case, stanza, where they set up the thematic tension that's going to drive the entire story. So I often encourage my students to think explicitly in terms of thematic tension. And I believe Keats clearly thought of that explicitly as he wrote this poem. There is a very deliberate series of contrasts that he creates in this stanza between sensuality and spirituality. So let's take a look. Saint Agnes Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Numb were the beadsman's fingers, while he told his rosary, and while his frosted breath, like pious incense from a censer old, seemed taking flight for heaven without a death, past the sweet Virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith. So let's analyze that opening stanza a bit. One thing I want to say about the rhythm and the rhyme scheme of the poem. So the rhythm is pretty straightforward, what we think of as iambic pentameter. That's a classic meter that's used in a lot of English poetry that's meant to mimic a kind of natural pattern of speech. An iamb is just an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and then pentameter means 5 beats. So, Saint Agnes Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. Do-do, 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 do-do. It's kind of a classic rhythm in a lot of poems that we're going to look at. But the stanzas that he uses are what we call Spenserian stanzas. A Spenserian stanza, it comes from Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. So what is a Spenserian stanza? It's just a stanza with a special rhyme scheme. The way we identify rhyme schemes when we analyze poetry, we look at the last word, the last syllable, and the last line, and we see what the rhyming pattern is. So the classic Spenserian rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, C. So the idea of a Spenserian stanza, the way I like to interpret it, is the rhyme scheme creates a sense of escalation, right? We sort of go A, B, and then we take the B, B, C, B, C, and then we take the C, 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 for a final pair of lines that conclude the stanza with a flourish. A lot of Spenserian stanzas and a lot of the stanzas in the Eve of St. Agnes have this escalation, this sense of rising as you read and building to the final line. And the final line is also rhythmically different than the rest of the poem. It's not iambic pentameter, but iambic hexameter. There are 6 beats rather than 5. And you can hear it in this final line. Past the sweet virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith. That is technically called an Alexandrine. It's a type of verse that was used in a lot of different poetry. We're not going to get too much into the complexities of poetic meter and the subtle meanings of all of this, because that could take a very long time. Instead, I'm interested in focusing on the poem itself. But obviously with poetry, we can't ignore rhythm. And there's clearly a nice, beautiful rhythm in each of these stanzas, right? A Spenserian stanza that builds often to a final line, right? So that final Alexandrine is usually very important, and we're going to look at many of those. But what are we setting up in this first stanza? The emphasis here is on the cold, on chilly weather, right? Bitter chill it was. And let's think of the different images Keats uses to convey this wintry landscape. The owl was cold. The hare was cold. The sheep in the field were silent, right? They're cold as well. And of course, we have the beadsman, the first human character we meet. He is going to kind of bookend this story. He's going to appear at the beginning in the first few stanzas, and then at the end. He's an important symbolic figure in this poem. He represents religion, obviously. He represents faith and spirituality. And notice the sensory details that we associate with the beadsman. His fingers are numb. His breath is frosted. And his breath is like pious incense from a censer old. The idea is the beadsman is associated with something old, something cold. This is all going to contrast with later in the poem when we see Porphyro and Madeline together. And we're going to kind of think about the contrast later when we get to those, but those scenes, those stanzas are going to be very warm and sensual, not old but new and young, and not pious or religious but earthly and sensual. And so we're seeing here Keats beginning his poem by setting up that contrast with a series of images associating spirituality with the cold, with chilliness. Continuing to read, his prayer he saith, this patient holy man, then takes his lamp and riseth from his knees, and back returneth, meagre, barefoot, wan, along the chapel aisle by slow degrees. The sculptured dead on each side seem to freeze, imprisoned in black purgatorial rails. Knights, ladies, praying in dumb oratories. He passeth by, and his weak spirit fails to think how they may ache in icy hoods and mails. So the beadsman is passing through the chapel, and he's noticing what's described as the sculptured dead. So once again, right, the imagery here is about sculptures. They are cold, they are dead, right? They are frozen. The phrase Keats uses is they are imprisoned in black purgatorial rails. Now, by the end of this poem, Madeline and Porphyro will essentially break free of the prison, right? They will essentially break free and escape together. So it's important that we set up people who have not escaped, people who have become imprisoned. They're dead, obviously, and they're sculptured, but the image here, the emphasis here is that they are imprisoned. It's not a very positive or beautiful image of the sculptures of a chapel, right? We might think of a chapel and think, oh yes, those beautiful, elaborate, vivid sculptures. But no, for Keats, those sculptures are not beautiful or vivid or alive. They are the exact opposite. They are dead. They are cold. And the beadsman has a moment of empathy where he thinks about how these people must ache in their icy hoods and mails. And so, once again, the setup, the emphasis of these early stanzas is on the chill, the cold, the chapel, the sort of all of these images associated with religion, with spirituality, are connected to a feeling of chilliness, a feeling of coldness. Now let's look at the next stanza, where we're going to get a little bit of a contrast. Northward he turneth through a little door, and scarce 3 steps, ere music's golden tongue flattered to tears this aged man and poor. But no, already had his death bell rung. The joys of all his life were said and sung. His was harsh penance on St. Agnes' Eve. Another way he went, and soon among rough ashes sat he for his soul's reprieve, and all night kept awake, for sinners' sake to grieve. So the beadsman hears music, very briefly. What does the description here say? Music's golden tongue flattered to tears this aged man and poor. So music is described as having a golden tongue. Already that's a very different image, a very different sensation than the cold chapel that we've just come from. And it's so beautiful, just 3 words, music's golden tongue, that it brings the beadsman to tears. But, as Keats emphasizes, he's already lived his life, right? His death bell has rung. He might as well be dead already. He has to sit in penance. And so again, spirituality, religion, Christianity is associated with coldness, with penance, right? With the beadsman sitting separated from the sensual beauty of music because he has to stay up. He has to stay up and, count his rosary for the sinner's sake. Now, sinners is an interesting word here because the question is going to be, of course, are Madeline and Porphyro sinners? In one context, they might be considered sinners. What we're going to see is essentially a version of a sex scene between them. That's, I think, one clear interpretation of what happens in the poem. But Keats does not believe they are sinners, at least in the true spiritual sense. They might be sinners according to the rigid definitions of Christianity. But for Keats, what they do, their love, elevates them beyond all of these concerns. They might sin, but they are not sinners, and they are not the people who the beadsman has to repent for. And we're going to see that when we get to the end of the poem. For now, though, what are we setting up? We're setting up the beadsman. We're setting up, again, all of these images of religion. Now, let's jump ahead a little bit. So there's a lot of stanzas, obviously, we could read in this poem, but I want to focus just on some of the key stanzas that give this context of romance, of revelry, of beauty, of sensory experience. And we're introduced to Madeline, who is one of our protagonists, and she is the young woman who is going to do the ritual, right? Do the famous ritual on St. Agnes' Eve, the sort of old wives' tale, where she is going to dream of her future husband. Now let's look at the description here of what she can expect on St. Agnes' Eve. This is a few stanzas down. They told her how, upon St. Agnes' Eve, young virgins might have visions of delight, and soft adorings from their loves receive, upon the honeyed middle of the night, if ceremonies due, they did aright. As, Supperless to bed they must retire, and couch supine their beauties lily white, nor look behind nor sideways, but require of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. Now, this is a really interesting stanza because, first of all, notice all of the words that Keats uses to emphasize sensory pleasure, worldly pleasure. First of all, the word delight. Young virgins might have visions of delight, and soft adorings from their loves received. So they're virgins, and yet they are receiving visions of delight and soft adorings. And then this is a great phrase, upon the honeyed middle of the night. So the middle of the night is associated with honey, something sweet, something sensual. Keats is creating a contrast here between our idea of virginity, the idea of coldness, of chilliness, basically those sensory images we set up at the beginning and associated with the beadsman, versus what Madeline is going to dream of, all of the beautiful sensory details that she's going to dream of. And this last line really hammers home that contrast of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. The word desire, he ends on the word desire, which is key, right? Even though this is a religious ceremony, you could argue. She's praying to St. Agnes. This is a religious ritual. The purpose of the religious ritual is desire. So Keats is very clearly creating a contrast here between spirituality and sensuality. That same theme that we talked about, it's going to be seen all the way through this poem. Now, let's look then at, so jumping ahead, we are then introduced to Porphyro, her lover, the one who has come to try and win her heart, to try and win her over. So let's look at the stanza that introduces Porphyro. Meantime, across the moors had come young Porphyro, with heart on fire for Madeline. Beside the portal doors, buttressed from moonlight, stands he, and implores all saints to give him sight of Madeline, but for one moment in the tedious hours, that he might gaze and worship all unseen, perchance speak, kneel, touch, kiss, in sooth, such things have been. So once again, the contrast between spirituality and sensuality. He's imploring the saints to give him sight of Madeline. So he's kind of praying to the saints. Lots of characters are praying in this, in different contexts. The beadsman is praying, right, with his rosary for the sinners. Madeline is praying, right, for this dream, this vision of her desire. And Porphyro is praying or imploring the saints for a sight of Madeline, the woman that he desires. Again, notice the language that Keats uses here, that he might gaze and worship all unseen. He wants to worship Madeline, but his style of worship is not the beadsman's style of worship. He is not counting rosaries for the sinners. He is not associated with the cold. His style of worship is to speak, kneel, touch, kiss. It is a sensual form of worship. You could argue that Keats is suggesting that maybe the true worship, the truest form of worship, is in sensual pleasure, is in sensual sensory experience. So let's look at the scene now. This is kind of the big scene of the poem, where Porphyro enters Madeline's chambers. Let's look at the description of Madeline's room here. Keats makes sure to describe the setting with its lush sensory detail, because again, he wants to emphasize the beauty of the place where this consummation is going to happen. So this is several stanzas, kind of towards the middle of the poem. A casement high and triple arched there was, all garlanded with carven imageries of fruits and flowers and bunches of knot grass, and diamonded with panes of quaint device, innumerable of stains and splendid dyes, as are the tiger moth's deep damasked wings. And in the midst, 'mong thousand heraldries and twilight saints and dim emblazonings, a shielded scutcheon blushed with blood of queens and kings. So it's an image of sort of the window and almost basically the images in the stained glass on the window. But the images here, notice, it's not the cold images of the chapel from the opening. Contrast these images with those opening descriptions of the cold marble. Here we have fruits and flowers and bunches of knot grass, and the word he uses to describe the panes of glass, diamonded with panes of quaint device. Just a great way of conveying the image of these, you can imagine these like diamond shapes in the panes of glass. But the word diamonded is so significant because it conveys luxury. It conveys luxury. It conveys worldliness. It conveys a kind of worldly sensual pleasure, a diamond, beautiful to look at. And for Keats, a diamond does not represent something negative. In a traditionally religious theme, in a poem that might follow traditional religious ideas, you might argue that, oh yes, the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good. But in this poem, Keats is inverting that traditional dichotomy and saying, no, maybe the truest form of spiritual perfection is through worldly things. Diamonds, fruits, flowers, splendid dyes, the tiger moth's deep damasked wings. And this description of heraldic images of kings and queens. The blood of kings and queens is important. I think it's a way that he's describing the red color of the glass. But again, red as a color, blood red, associated with life, with the pounding of blood, with sensuality, as opposed to the beadsmen and those carved statues at the beginning in the chapel. There was no blood in those statues. They were cold. They were lifeless. But in Madeline's chamber, where Porphyro has come to win her love, there is blood. There is life. If we keep reading, and now we get the real sexual images, this is Keats's way, essentially, of conveying consummation, a sex scene, but implicitly, implicitly through this medieval legend. So let's look at the next stanza, which describes Madeline. Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm jewels on Madeline's fair breast, as down she knelt for heaven's grace and boon. Rose bloom fell on her hands, together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint. She seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed, save wings for heaven. Porphyro grew faint. She knelt, so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint. So Madeline is praying now. She has knelt to pray to Saint Agnes. And again, think of the complexity here and the tension. She's described as pure. She's described as free from mortal taint. She's described as an angel, a saint. And yet, the window, the idea is the moon is shining through the window and kind of throwing the reflection of the window onto her fair breast, Rose bloom fell on her hand. So the idea is the red from the window is shining onto her. I think the tension Keats is creating here is that tension between the purity of spirituality, the purity of Madeline as an angel free from mortal taint, versus this red cast, this red light that gets thrown on her through the window. And I think this last line, she knelt so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint, is slightly ironic, because what's about to happen? She is about to, you could argue, sin with Porphyro. She and Porphyro are about to consummate their love. She's about to become mortally tainted, so to speak. And yet, as we're going to see, Keats is going to suggest that it's actually not mortal taint, that it actually elevates her and Porphyro above the saints and above the angels. So let's keep reading. Anon his heart revives, Her vespers done, of all its wreathed pearls, her hair she frees, unclasps her warmed jewels one by one, loosens her fragrant bodice. By degrees her rich attire creeps, rustling to her knees. Half hidden, like a mermaid in seaweed, pensive awhile she dreams awake, and sees in fancy fair Saint Agnes in her bed, but dares not look behind, or all the charm is fled. Now we get a really sensual image, right, of her undoing her hair, right, freeing her hair. This is an image that the painters of the 19th century loved. There are so many paintings of Madeline in her room undoing her hair, those pre-Raphaelite paintings from the mid-19th century, and they basically really indulge in the sensoriness of it all. I mean, it's a very sexual image. Madeline undoes her hair and then loosens her fragrant bodice. Again, notice the sensory detail. It's not just her bodice, it's a fragrant bodice. And so Porphyro is watching all of this. She's essentially naked now. She's like a mermaid in seaweed. Think of how much this contrasts with the supposed idea of Madeline as a pure angel free from mortal taint, a pure, splendid angel. Notice how sexualized she is in Porphyro's eyes. Again, the contrast Keats is going for here between spirituality and sensuality. It's creating tension in the story. That's the thing that I often say in my creative writing classes, is when you've identified a thematic conflict, two different ideas, we want to see those themes in conflict with each other in the story. And it's through that tension that you get the drama of the narrative. And that's what we have here. Tension between Madeline as a spiritual being and Madeline as a sensual being. And we're going to see which one of these is going to win out. Which one of these is going to emerge victorious? I think we already know. So she goes to sleep, right? We're going to jump ahead a little bit here. And so she goes to sleep, and this is when Porphyro decides to put his plan into action, to try and essentially appear to her in her dream. So jumping a few stanzas down, first he's going to basically set up a feast for her. Then by the bedside, where the faded moon made a dim silver twilight, soft he set a table, and, half anguished, threw thereon a cloth of woven crimson, gold, and jet. Oh, for some drowsy Morphean amulet, the boisterous midnight festive clarion, the kettle drum, and far-heard clarinet affray his ears, though but in dying tone. The hall door shuts again, and all the noise is gone. So Keats is playing with kind of different senses here. There's the music from outside, right? The idea is in this castle, there's some sort of party going on. There's some sort of revelry happening. So we keep hearing this music as Porphyro opens and shuts the door as he needs. And notice, though, the emphasis here, a cloth of woven crimson, gold, and jet. You know, he's setting up a feast for Madeline, but Keats is really going to emphasize the sensory details of everything, even the cloth that he puts on the table. Because, as I've said before, there is no piece of sensory detail that is too much, especially in a poem like this where the sensory details are the point, where the sensuality is the point. In a situation like this, you sort of have to, as a writer, lean into the sensory descriptions. If we keep reading, the next stanza where he now sets up the feast. And still she slept in azure-lidded sleep, in blanched linen, smooth and lavendered, while he forth from the closet brought a heap of candied apple, quince and plum and gourd, with jellies soother than the creamy curd, and lucent syrups tinct with cinnamon, manna and dates in argosy transferred from Fez, and spiced dainties every one, from silken Samarkand to cedared Lebanon. So this is a wonderful stanza which introduces us to the food that he prepares for her, the elaborate feast. This is one of the more famous stanzas in the poem because of Keats's emphasis on the sensual pleasure of food here. But even notice, before we even get to the food, he loves to remind us that Madeline is sleeping and she's beautiful and sensual even as she sleeps. What is the phrase he uses? Blanched linen, smooth and lavendered. It's an azure-lidded sleep. Even her sleep is described in sensual terms, right? Azure-lidded, lavendered. Keats wants us to feel the sensory beauty of this setting, of this room with Madeline sleeping and Porphyro setting up this beautiful feast for her. Exactly the opposite of the chapel in the beginning. We've totally moved from the cold beadsman to the warmth and lushness of the world of the senses now. And the emphasis here, all of these foods that he includes, lucent syrups tincted with cinnamon. Cinnamon, of course, would have been very evocative as a spice of the East, of faraway lands. Manna and dates. He's emphasizing, what are the places that he mentions? Fez, which is a city in Morocco, Samarkand, which is a city in Central Asia, and cedared Lebanon, again, the East, the Near East. So the three places he mentions are far away, and especially for the Middle Ages, these would have been distant, exotic lands. So there's a kind of exoticism to the sensuality here. This is part of a larger trend in general where throughout the Middle Ages and the 19th century, the East was always associated with pleasure, right? There was this idea that these Muslim rulers in the East, these Arabian rulers, these Arabian sultans, they understood pleasure in a way that the cold Christians of Europe did not. In some cases, it was meant to critique the Islamic world for being decadent, but for Keats, that decadence is a good thing. That decadence is something positive. That decadence is where he believes, right, true spirituality lies, in the sensory world. So if we keep reading, these delicates he heaped with glowing hand on golden dishes, and in baskets bright of wreathed silver. Sumptuous they stand in the retired quiet of the night, filling the chilly room with perfume light. And now, my love, my seraph fair, awake! Thou art my heaven, and I thine eremite. Open thine eyes for meek Saint Agnes' sake, or I shall drowse beside thee, so my soul doth ache. So again, notice the sensory details, the golden dishes, the wreathed silver. They are sumptuous. Even this wonderful description of the light, filling the chilly room with perfume light. Right, we have this mingling of the senses. The light is perfume light. You can smell the light. It's like perfume. What a beautiful phrase to really whirl together all these senses in this room. And then he asks her to awake. And again, notice the tension between sensuality and spirituality. He says, thou art my heaven. He calls her a seraph, which is, a high order of angels in Christianity. He refers to himself as an eremite, which is just a word for a hermit. But obviously there's a bit of irony here because he's not a hermit. A hermit would not have all of these foods from the East decked out in this marvelous feast for a woman he's about to seduce, for a woman he wants to sleep with. So I think there's a lot of irony going on in this religious language. It's part of the tension that Keats is creating between spirituality and sensuality. So he calls to her, but she doesn't wake up yet. So let's jump down because he's going to try one more thing, which is her lute, which Angela mentioned earlier. Awakening up, he took her hollow lute, tumultuous, and in chords that tenderest be, he played an ancient ditty, long since mute, in Provence called La Belle Dame Sans Merci, close to her ear, touching the melody. Wherewith disturbed she uttered a soft moan. He ceased, she panted quick, and suddenly her blue, afraid eyes wide open shone. Upon his knees he sank, pale as smooth sculptured stone. So he plays music for her. He takes up her lute and he plays music in her ear. This is maybe the most sexual stanza we have here. She uttered a soft moan. He ceased. She panted quick. And then her blue eyes opened. Right? I mean, that is as sexual as you get without being explicit. And again, think about what we're emphasizing here, the sensory pleasure, the sensory experience. What is it that wakes her up? It's this lute. It's this music that he plays. And notice the last line. He sinks to his knees as she awakes, and he's described as pale as smooth sculptured stone. Because at this point, he doesn't know if his plan is going to work. Is she going to wake up and associate him with the vision in her dream? Is she going to make the connection? Is she going to fall in love? Well, the idea is she's already in love with him, but they can't be together. But is she going to be convinced, essentially, to run away with him? He doesn't know that yet. He is pale as smooth sculptured stone. I think that's an image that's meant to evoke the sculptures from the beginning, from the chapel. But he's more than just stone, of course, because he's full of life, as we're going to see. He's full of sensory life. So once again, there's that tension, there's that irony that Keats so wisely and masterfully uses here. And so then she speaks. She's still kind of half in a dream state, but she sees Porphyro and she kind of begs him to speak again, to sing again in her ear. She wants him, basically. And let's look at what she says. "Ah, Porphyro," said she, "but even now thy voice was at sweet tremble in mine ear, made tunable with every sweetest vow. And those sad eyes were spiritual and clear. How changed thou art, how pallid, chill, and drear. Give me that voice again, my Porphyro, those looks immortal, those complainings dear. Oh, leave me not in this eternal woe, for if thou diest, my love, I know not where to go." So she's noticing that he looks pallid and chill and drear. Remember, he looks like a piece of sculptured stone. He looks like one of the saints from the chapel at the beginning, and she doesn't want that. She wants sensuality. She wants the music in her ear. She wants him to sing again. And what does she say? "Leave me not in this eternal woe." I think that's such a key line because for her, not being with Porphyro is eternal woe. Later, we're going to see when Porphyro and Madeline escape, Keats implies that they become eternal, right? That they essentially achieve a kind of immortality. So the word eternal here is really key. She doesn't want to be in this eternal woe. She wants to be with him forever. She wants to be in a sort of eternity as lovers with him. Now, the next stanza is great because it describes how he kind of enters her dream, so to speak. Remember, she's asleep and she's half dreaming. The idea, of course, is that she's supposed to dream of her future husband, and she's dreaming of Porphyro, she thinks. But Porphyro is actually there. This was, of course, his plan. Let's look at this stanza now. "Beyond a mortal man, impassioned far at these voluptuous accents." Notice, right, her voice is described as voluptuous. Again, really sensual. "He arose, ethereal, flushed, and like a throbbing star seen mid the sapphire heaven's deep repose, into her dream he melted, as the rose blendeth its odor with the violet. Solution sweet." Again, I think there's very sexual imagery there. He is a throbbing star, and he melts into her dream like a rose, blending its odor with the violet. Right? She is the violet, he is the rose, and their odors are melting together into a solution sweet. Again, that's pretty explicit. I'm not sure Keats could get much more explicit than this without saying it outright. "Meantime, the frost wind blows like a love's alarm, pattering the sharp sleet against the window panes. St. Agnes' moon hath set." I think that stanza is the consummation, because the moon sets, St. Agnes' moon sets, implying that St. Agnes' Eve is reaching its end. It's almost over. And wind starts to blow against the window panes, right? It's a storm. But this stanza, in that moment, that phrase, solution sweet, I believe that is the climax of their consummation, of them coming together. That is the moment of sexual release. Whether it's literal or not is not the point. Some people might get caught up in, oh, do they actually have sex? That's not the point. The point is that Keats is using this Christian story of the Eve of St. Agnes to tell a story of two lovers coming together, and through sensory pleasure, through sensuality, through music and food, consummating this earthly love that they feel, and consummating it in a very earthly way, the rose blending its odor with the violet. Now, where do we go from here? Now we have the consummation. They are together. He basically wakes her up. He says, it's no dream. It's real. I'm here. And he basically says to her, let's run away. This storm that's happening, we can use it, right? Everyone is too busy sort of drinking and revel in their revelry to listen. We can run away. So let's look at this stanza where he says all this. Hark, 'tis an elfin storm from fairyland, of haggard seeming, but a boon indeed. So fairyland. There's a lot of references in Keats's poems and other English poems to fairies and to fairyland. The idea is almost as kind of a alternate spiritual world, an alternate world to the world of Christianity. You have the world of the fae, you have the world of fairies, which are associated with a certain, I would say, in this case, sensory delight. The fairies are on their side. The fairies are there to help them. And so the idea is he's saying, well, this is a storm from fairyland. It is here to help us. We can escape through this storm. Of haggard seeming, but a boon indeed. Arise, arise, the morning is at hand. The bloated wassailers will never heed. Let us away, my love, with happy speed. There are no ears to hear or eyes to see, drowned all in Rhenish and the sleepy mead. Awake, arise, my love, and fearless be, for o'er the southern moors I have a home for thee. I think what's interesting there, he's saying basically all the people in this castle, they're too drunk to hear us. They're drunk on Rhenish, which is a reference to wine, and sleepy mead. And they have no ears to hear or eyes to see. So, this is an interesting contrast because the beadsman is one type of alternative to Porphyro and Madeline. He is the anti-sensual religious person counting his rosary. The wassailers, right, as he calls them here, the people down in the castle partying, they're another alternative. They're almost an example of the excess of sensory pleasure in a way. They're so drunk that they lose their senses. And it's only Porphyro and Madeline who exist kind of in between them, who have perfectly embodied sensory pleasure and sensory delight. And he's saying they won't be able to hear us because they've drunk so much, they can no longer hear, they can no longer see. So let's go. And of course they do. So let's look at the last two stanzas now to see how this all concludes. They glide like phantoms into the wide hall. Like phantoms to the iron porch they glide, where lay the porter in uneasy sprawl, with a huge empty flagon by his side. The wakeful bloodhound rose and shook his hide, but his sagacious eye an inmate owns. By one and one the bolts full easy slide, the chains lie silent on the foot-worn stones. The key turns, and the door upon its hinges groans. So what do we have there, right? First, I really like the word phantoms that Keats uses. I think this is really key because for a long time, Madeline and Porphyro have been real physical bodies, right? We've seen especially Madeline, right? The sensuality of her body. We've seen Porphyro, the way he arranges the table, the way he plays the lute. Sensory experience, bodily experience has been so important in this poem. But now that they've achieved their consummation, they become phantoms as they escape. And I think that's so beautiful and so telling, right? That Now they can escape the boundaries of the flesh, but only after they have experienced the pleasures of the flesh. And even the word phantoms, right? Phantoms are different than statues, than the cold marble from the opening. Phantoms, they are beyond the physical world now. They have become ethereal, and they kind of float away through the castle. They glide, is the word that Keats uses, which is such a beautiful word to convey their escape, a kind of silent, soundless gliding away like phantoms. I also just like that final sensual detail. The door groans, the hinges groan as the door opens. And this opens us into the final stanza. So let's look at this final stanza. And they are gone. Aye, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. That night, the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long benightmared. Angela the old died palsy-twitched, with meager face deform. The beadsman, after 1,000 aves told, for I unsought, for slept among his ashes cold. So it's a really kind of beautiful but also chilling final stanza, because we don't actually end on Madeline and Porphyro. The last two lines they get, and these are my favorite lines of the poem, and they are gone, aye, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. It's almost as if we've jumped forward in time now. As soon as they leave the castle together, they disappear. Not just from the castle on a literal sense, but from the very pages, from the very stanzas of the poem. From time itself, they disappear. What they've done essentially is they've escaped time. I think that's what Keats is trying to say here by jumping forward like this. Aye, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. They disappear like phantoms. They escape. They transcend, essentially, the physical world. Where do they go? Well, they go to his home on the moors, literally. But otherwise, they just disappear. They vanish. It doesn't matter where they go. The point is that they have escaped time and they have escaped death. Because what does the rest of the stanza describe? It describes the other characters, the Baron and Angela and the beadsman, right? All of whom are sleeping, suffering from nightmares, and then dying, right? What do his warrior guests dream of? Witch, demon, and large coffin worm, right? They're all dreaming of death. Angela dies palsy-twitched, and even the beadsman, right? The beadsman who we began with, he's still, after 1,000 aves told, he dies. His ashes become cold. We return to the coldness of the beginning of the poem, because it's as if now that Madeline and Porphyro have disappeared, have escaped, sensory delight and sensory experience goes with them, and we return to the coldness of religion, the coldness of spirituality without sensuality. And so, what do we think Keats is saying here? What do Madeline and Porphyro represent? They symbolize sensual delight, obviously, sensual pleasure, because that's what we see them engage in. They represent sexual union, sexual consummation, and they don't get punished for it, right? They are not sinners who we must grieve. They escape. They get the happy ending. They flee into the storm and disappear like phantoms. I love that image because it seems to suggest that through worldly sensory experience, through sensual delight, you can transcend the boundaries of time and space. They transcend the boundaries of time because the poem jumps forward in time, aye, ages long ago. But they also transcend the boundaries of space because they seem to have disappeared entirely from the lines of the poem, from the stanzas of the poem. If the stanzas of the poem provide a structure and a setting, the chapel and the house and the surrounding, estate and manor, they are gone now. They are no longer in the poem. They have escaped. They have transcended. They have survived. And I think this is Keats's very beautiful declaration of the power of sensory delight and sensory experience. It's what makes Keats clearly a romantic poet, because he is celebrating sensory experience, elevating it to something sacred, something transcendent. Unlike traditional religion, which the beadsman represents, traditional religion, all it leads to is your ashes cold, coldness, death, a lack of warmth, a lack of spirit, a lack of sensuality. But sensual delight, what Madeline and Porphyro experience and achieve, that for Keats and for the Romantics, that is true spiritual fulfillment. So that tension that we saw throughout the poem between spirituality and sensuality, it is resolved by essentially Keats saying that through sensuality, they can achieve a spiritual transcendence that even the religious figures in the poem can never achieve. Even the beadsmen cannot achieve. And I think that's such a beautiful sentiment, a beautiful articulation, defense of worldly pleasure. And it's no accident that he sets this in the Middle Ages, right? In a religious time period, but in a very sensual Middle Ages. A Middle Ages that really glorifies love, that really glorifies sensory experience. It's the sort of romantic 19th century vision of the Middle Ages. Knights and ladies and courtly love and fairy lands and romance, not the Middle Ages of cold spirituality. And I think beyond that, Keats is making an argument about, in terms of poetry, in terms of writing, he's making an argument in favor of sensory description and sensory detail. As a writer, I think about this all the time, and I think a lot of writers do. There's often this tension between description and meaning. Sometimes I think readers struggle with description because they often feel it doesn't tell them what to think or what to feel. I've often heard people say, and I can't believe they say this, but I've heard people say that when they read, they skip the descriptions. That's insane. How can you skip the descriptions? Without the descriptions, this poem is nothing, right? You need those sensory descriptions of Porphyro and the food and Madeline, right? Beautiful in the moonlight. Those descriptions are the essence of the poem. What Keats is essentially saying is that sensory description is meaning. Sensory description is what gives meaning to life. Sensual delight is what leads to spiritual transcendence. He does not see a dichotomy between the spirit and the senses. He resolves that dichotomy at the end by saying, no, the senses are the path to the spirit. And in terms of writing, I think you could say the same thing. Sensory detail and sensory description is the path to meaning. And so I love this poem, and this is why I want this to be the first poem we analyze, because I think at its core, it celebrates a way of writing that I believe still today is the essence of all good fiction writing. Emphasis on sensory details, emphasis on sensory experience to make us feel what the characters are feeling. And as a result, to feel the emotions of the piece, to feel the emotions of what the characters are feeling. And Keats does that, so magically and so wonderfully in this. All right, so we're going to look at more Keats poems in the future. We're going to look at more romantic poems in the future. But we'll wrap up there for today. Hopefully you enjoyed my analysis of The Eve of St. Agnes, one of my favorite poems. If you hadn't read it before, what I recommend is to sit down and read it through in one sitting and just relish the sensory experience of it. Relish the rhythms, right? Those Spenserian stanzas that we talked about, that beautiful building, escalating rhyme scheme, and really let the feelings of those final stanzas wash over you. The feelings of those lovers fleeing away into the storm. All right, thank you, everyone. And with that, we'll wrap up. Remember, if you like what you heard, please share the podcast, subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.